Thank you very much, Margo, for that kind introduction. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Camden Conference and its audience, its patrons, for inviting me here. And it's wonderful being here with my friends and colleagues to discuss the Middle East over the course of the next 2 days. It's no exaggeration to say that the Middle East has gone through a tremendous amount of trauma, shock, and change over the past 2 years and so since Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th. This is a region that was supposed to be gradually sidelined in global affairs for the United States and for its European allies as focus shift onto China, to other sets of global issues, and focus on new technologies and the like. And yet the region managed to reinsert itself into our foreign policy discussions and global affairs. Now, looking at what's happened, it's very easy to say it's the same old Middle East. It's the same sets of issues. It's in the same places. It's between Israel and the Arabs. It's over Iran, and it's between the United States and Iran. It's the same set of conversations around Iran's nuclear program, its proxies, its missiles, etc. And that at some level is true. But I think, and I want to argue that what we have witnessed in the past 2 years, and we still are not at the end of it, is some fundamental changes to this region. I mean, there's some basic rules of the road, some basic balance of power, some basic structures in the region have significantly changed. And we're still, as I said, we're not at the end of it. The Gaza war hasn't finished. The fate of Iran is right now hangs in the balance. But beyond all the sort of the pain, the trauma, the political issues, the humanitarian concerns that we see, we also have to take stock of what is it that we need to know about the fundamental changes in the region. I mean, the Middle East, as we're speaking, is being shaped by 2 major wars. One that started in Gaza, that is still ongoing, and its verdict is not settled. It's not just shaping Gaza and the future of the Palestinians, it ultimately will shape the future of Syria and Lebanon as well. And the second one is a larger war with Iran that started, in a way, started with the Gaza war itself, but then it blew up in a war between Iran and Israel, and then Iran, Israel, and the United States in June of last year. And now, as we are speaking, it might ignite into its next, much more perhaps a dramatic phase. And I think these 2 wars, more than anything else, is deciding essentially who are the winners, who are the losers, where is the new lines of divisions in the region are taking shape. Now, just before going here, I want to sort of step back. If we looked at October 6th, just before Hamas launched its dramatic and catastrophic, I would say, attack on Israel, there was a theory for the Middle East that particularly the Biden administration was pursuing, was that there was a future for the region. And it was not just a good future for the region, it was a theory about how to make the region less relevant to global affairs. Was that the region's future would lie in economic integration, trade corridors that will connect India all the way to Europe, going through the Gulf countries and through Israel, create prosperity along the way for the people of the region, but also create certain cartilage between the Arabs and the Israelis. And this was obviously a vision that had support in the region, because particularly the Arab countries of the Gulf saw this as very much in line with their own vision of post-oil economies, their investments in being the hub of global trade, services, technology, and the like. And obviously there are inconveniences in the region. There were conflicts, actors, et cetera, that had to be contained, managed, sidelined. And some of this would be happening. The assumption of this vision was that the Palestinian issue would not be a spoiler, would not matter, and that this whole idea could basically go around them, go over them. that the Gulf countries were starting to normalize relations with Iran, which is a way of basically creating much less tension in the Gulf and making this idea feasible. And for the United States, the idea was that there could potentially be either a nuclear deal with Iran, which the Biden administration never got to, or that you could have some kinds of ad hoc arrangement with the Iranians that would get them to not do certain things in exchange for certain economic benefits. And so there was a view that you could contain what's bad in the Middle East, manage it, and then basically have this vision of economic integration essentially define the region. And obviously the core to this would be a Saudi-Israeli normalization, which was not only necessary for building this trade relationship, but also it was necessary to essentially end the Israeli-Arab conflict that the administration was after. Now, the Hamas attack on Israel, beyond all the ways in which we've looked at it, its greatest significance was perhaps that it ended this theory. In other words, what happened is that the part of the Middle East that was supposed to be contained and managed and to be set aside actually proved itself to be unruly and spoiled the party. You know, Hamas's attack immediately made the Palestinian issue central. Doesn't matter how you dealt with it, how Israel wanted to deal with it, how the Arabs suggested it should be dealt with it, how the Palestinians thought it should be dealt with it. There was no way of now having a vision for the future of the region without dealing with it. And then what came along with the Hamas attack was this alliance that Iran had put together in the region, in and around Israel, of Hezbollah, of its proxies in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, as well as in the Palestinian territories, that essentially became the other major political actor in the Middle East. In other words, the Arabs that the United States assumed would be the partners to the future of the Middle East with Israel and in this economic vision were sidelined as Israel's main protagonist, and the other power broker became this axis of resistance. I think the course of the war, of course, changed many things in the Middle East. Everything that happened in Gaza was transformative to the region, and also was consequential for Israel in many regards. But also, I think it changed Israel in important ways. It changed its conception of its security, of the minimum that it requires, of where the parameters lies, and what it's willing to do to achieve it. And I think Israel became much more willing to take greater risks at greater costs in order to achieve its security goals. And that single fact in of itself is one of the important rules that has actually changed in the region. Now, I would say that the war at the beginning, there was a first phase to the war, which is in which, I sort of, one has to also say, well, you know, once this plan was upended, that essentially the Biden administration never had a plan B. Even throughout the Gaza war, it kept going back to the idea of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and going back to the idea that somehow this war too can be managed and contained, and you could go back to the theory you had before, which proved to be a foolhardy way of looking at it. I mean, they never had their hand around the scale to which the Hamas attack and the Gaza war was changing the region in profound ways. And I have to say that the Trump administration hasn't changed much either. I mean, its view of its engagement with the Gulf countries is around business and is around the economic vision of those countries. Maybe the word trade corridor is in there, but instead of actual trade corridor, it's really talk about AI and data center supply chain and services and financial supply chains. But it's still a vision that is sort of assumes that economic conception of the region can emerge. Although President Trump has in fits and starts thought about how does he fix or contain the parts of the Middle East that are unruly. And I think in some ways his war with Iran on, war with Iran off again is really about how does he contain the Iran issue, right? Some days it's the nuclear issue. Some days he really wants them to be a different regime, just like Venezuela, just same guys do some things differently so that we can get on with the Gulf. But I mean, part of the fundamental, I think, issue is that given the changes that have happened, that the United States has not really caught up with how much has changed and how to actually think of a policy or a vision for the region that takes into these things into account. Now, as I said, the war had a first phase in which Israel seemed to be battling on all fronts against axis of resistance. And this was then seen as an ascendant force, that the networks that Iran had created had been mobilized. The success of axis of resistance was to surprise Israel with Hamas's attack, to be able to attack Israel on multiple fronts, from the Houthis hitting shipping or ports in south of Israel by missiles, from Hezbollah being able to hit targets inside Israel, and but also Iran being able to mobilize and manage all of these. There's a force that was seen to be weak enough for the United States to contain and put in a box, now was out in the open and was the main protagonist of Israel. It was the part of the Arab world that seemed to be forefront, was not the ones that had engaged Israel or were engaging Israel, but was this axis of resistance. But then, I think by April of 2024, a different phase in the war set in. And that is that Israel began to push the boundaries of just the war in Gaza to actually a broader war against the axis of resistance, and to essentially resolve, not only to, I would say, once and for all fix the Palestinian issue by defining territory, defining the parameters by which the final picture would be, but also to also address the issue of Hezbollah, Syria, Houthis as well. I mean, these things put together is what Iran had called the ring of fire around Israel. In other words, caging Israel around by having these forces on its borders, that Israel basically no longer wanted to deal with this kind of a security threat, not just in Gaza, but not in Lebanon, West Bank, in Syria either. And Israel started, if you would, with the first time attacking Iran's consulate in Damascus, which seemed at the beginning not a big deal. And there was a debate about whether it was a consulate, it was not a consulate. But the step was very, very clear that Israel was going beyond just addressing the Hamas issue or just the Hezbollah issue. It was going to address actually the axis of resistance as a whole. And from there, escalation continued, because Iran retaliated for that attack with a barrage of missiles and drones against Israel, which, as ineffective as it seemed, it was significant in the fact that the shadow war between Iran and Israel, which had gone on for a very long time in form of cyber attack, assassinations here and there, attacks here and there, bombings here and there, actually came out in the form of an actual war. Iran hit Israel with missiles. Israel hit Iran's air defenses with missiles. This is what war between Iran and Israel look like. They're never going to be fighting with soldiers and tanks. They don't have borders with each other. And this was, if you would, a very new phase of the war. Now, it was a phase of the war that Israel would start to win very quickly, in a very different way that it had won in Gaza, with far less political cost to its reputation, with far less, if you would, humanitarian collateral damage. The exchange of missiles with Iran was followed by a daring series of operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which I'm sure you all heard, from the pager attacks that killed and disrupted, killed a lot of Hezbollah commanders, operatives, and disrupted its operations, followed by systematic assassination of senior commanders. Their second order commanders, third order commanders, and then ultimately the organization's longtime leader, Hassan Nasrallah, which was a major blow because Hezbollah essentially was a very key actor in the axis of resistance, Iran's most important regional ally. And not only that, it was actually Iran's most important first line of defense against Israel. Hezbollah's missiles were a threat to Israel, but also for that reason, they kept Israel's hand from taking the war directly to Iran. The defanging of Hezbollah, if you would, was followed by the unraveling of the Assad regime in Syria. Now, this was not a doing of Israel directly, although the circumstances of the war may have contributed to it, but it was a good coincidence, if you would, that the collapse of Hezbollah, the fall of Lebanon, was quickly followed by the fall of Syria. Now, the importance of it was that in one swoop, between April of 2024 and December of 2024, when Assad fell, Iran largely, basically, completely collapsed in the Levant area, in and around Israel. In other words, its pressure on the borders of Israel almost disappeared altogether. Now, it is perhaps an outcome of the war that Iran had built this axis of resistance over the years. It had built this deterrence around Israel, but it had never it was built not with the intention of being used in an offensive manner. Yes, you could pinprick Israel here and there just to say that it's there, but it was not what Hamas did was essentially starting a major offensive war with Israel that neither Hezbollah nor Syria and ultimately nor Iran had the capacity to actually fight that sort of a war with Israel. And so when Hamas started the war and Israel decided to go against that deterrence really was not capable of withstanding a full-fledged, determined Israeli assault. And so over that 6-month period, Iran's positions in Levant collapsed completely. Now, that in itself is one of the fundamental changes that has happened in the region. I mean, Hezbollah was established by Iran, helped established in 1982. When Israel left Lebanon in 2000, from then on, it essentially operated as an Iranian proxy, Iranian missile system sitting on Israel's borders, and it created a certain balance of force or balance of terror, as was called, between Israel and Iran. In other words, containing Israel's ability to use its militarily, technologically superior military to actually deal a decisive blow to the Islamic Republic. So for the first time after more than 2 decades, Israel basically was relieved of that kind of a pressure on its border. Its ability to project its power in the region, and particularly against its main adversary, became far more. So in a way, I think the region went from some kind of a balance between Israel and Iran, essentially to no balance between them. That balance was lost very quickly. And that's actually in some ways is playing in Lebanon today. Israel's ability to dictate the future of Lebanon, occupy parts of its territory, be a much more overt player in deciding the fate of the country is one consequence. The role that it also plays in Syria is a consequence of that. In other words, not only was Israel relieved of Iranian pressure, it was also relieved of any pressure to exercise a much greater territorial and political influence within the region around it. So it today is in a larger portion of Syria and Lebanon than it was before, with far more say in what would be the future of those countries. Now, But the victory also, in a way, I think changed more in the region. Namely, Israel emerged, if you would, from this, at least the first phase, even before the June war with Iran, to which I'll come. It emerged essentially with not only belief in itself, but also very apparent to the entire region that it is now an uncontested military superpower in the region. It's the most powerful military force in the region. And also that the ways in which the region always dealt with assumers of greater power in the region, which is U.S. intervention to balance and control, does not apply to Israel. Right? It didn't do under the Biden administration. It's just an open question under the Trump administration. Aside from the good and bad of it, it's not that, but it's in the classic sort of a balance of power sense. You have a new rising military force that has come out of a war, confident in its own abilities, capable of settling not only disputes around it, but even imagining that it can dictate to the region a security, an overall security architecture, an overall arrangement, change borders, define rules of the game, that makes it, if you would, a uncontested regional hegemon, right? And it, for instance, became, this was quite obvious that when Israel decided to assassinate the leaders of Hamas in Qatar, right, which is an ally of the United States. And the question, largely the message to the region, was that Israel will decide where and when it would attack, and also it would decide what kinds of political relationships other countries could have or couldn't have, or who could they host or not host, right? And again, the lesson of Qatar was that the United States would not or could not basically prevent this from happening, right? And that this is a completely, if you would, new circumstance to the region. And in a way, it is also impacting other countries as well. For instance, Turkey also feels that it's increasingly is facing Israeli pressure. I mean, just a few days ago, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said Turkey is the new Iran. And essentially, which actually tells you two things, which is one is in large measure, Iran is a far less concern. In another measure is that Israel does not see as a rising military power why it shouldn't decide the playing field to its own advantage and deal with adversaries while it has this capability to do so. Now, that has led to a lot of hand-wringing. I mean, generally, the Middle East does not like a single actor dominating. For a long period, the United States wouldn't allow it, particularly with Iran. The United States intervened multiple times to prevent, whether in the Gulf or the broader region, from Iran asserting itself. But generally, the region itself also has not liked this. In the 1960s, when Arab nationalism in the era of Gamal Abdel Nasser was ascendant, Israel, Turkey, and Iran got together to balance out the Arabs. David Ben-Gurion referred to it as the periphery theory. The countries around the Arab world, all of whom did not like this sort of ascendance of the Arabs. During the decades where Iran poised as a rising power, or at least particularly the Arabs saw it as a rising power, dominating in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, that they began to get much closer to Israel to jointly balance against Iran. And now, I mean, it's the same rules applying. It's not about just the old animosity or old rivalries with Israel. It is that now that Israel is becoming, if you would, an unchallenged hegemon, the instinct of the region is also to find other ways to balance Israel. And the United States is not a reliable option here. The U.S. will not, because the U.S. is much better if you're balancing against an adversary of the U.S., not against the U.S.'s closest ally. Right? And therefore they are grappling for finding alternatives. For instance, Saudi Arabia's reaction to the attack on Qatar was to form a strategic defense partnership with Pakistan, which for a period Turkey said it might join as well. It's not a compensation, but it just suggests that the countries in the region also think that sort of a reaction is necessary. And as a result, one important element in the region that has come out of the Gaza war and that collapse of Iran's position in the region is a shifting, if you would, attempts to find a new balance internally. The United States is not providing it and may not be able to provide it. What it takes for the United States to provide it, the U.S. is not capable or willing to do, which also means imposing certain red lines and rules on Israel, and it's not willing to do that. And therefore, the region is trying to figure out how to do that. Now, the disappearance of Iran also has had other consequences. I think perhaps, to some extent, the Saudi-UAE rivalry or spat is more conceivable if in an era that Iran's threat to them may be less. In fact, one might think that the entire idea of a GCC was set up in order to contain Iran. So, the fact that this group of countries would have coherence and their individual issues are not going to come out if Iran is no longer the singular threat to them is an interesting open question. Now, the second, I would say, aside from the rise of Israel, which is one side of what's happened out of the Gaza war and how the region is going to be dealing with that, is the unraveling of Iran, if you would. And tomorrow I know Suzanne is going to talk much more in depth about Iran. But at the level of the region, in some ways, the Middle East, the security order, the regional order, United States engagement with it since 1979 has been in many ways shaped by Iran's challenged threat to the region. From the Carter Doctrine that brought the United States to make a commitment to defending allies in the Gulf, to gradually building bases in the region, providing security for oil trade, for mercantile trade in the region, providing security umbrella to the Gulf countries, they all basically came with Iran. And the idea that the United States would organize a sort of alliance of Arab countries to contain Iran, it goes back to 1979. The role of Iran after almost 47 years is changing. It's unraveled in the region, as I mentioned. Its role in the Levant is gone. Its position in Iraq and Yemen may come next. But it's much weaker in the region than it was before. At least its ability to project power in the region in the manner that it did is gone. But also internally, the fate of the Islamic Republic is now open to question. It's not just the region; it is also that the revolution itself will end or could end. And again, there is a series of events in the region that has accelerated this. We could go back and say there's a number of years now that the Islamic Republic looks exhausted, the revolution is done, the people are unhappy. But the events since the Gaza war has accelerated this. In particular, with the shadow of Hezbollah's missiles lifted from it, Israel felt no worry or no deterrence against attacking Iran directly, which it did in June of 2025. It surprised Iran. It killed large numbers of its of military commanders, nuclear scientists, attacked its military installations, missile sites, nuclear sites. And then on the 9th day of that war, the United States joined in for a total of 45 minutes to destroy Iran's hardened nuclear facilities, but no more. And then the war ended after 12 days. Israel achieved a lot in that war, in the sense of hitting Iran, in some ways humiliating it, destroying a lot in Iran, but the war was not as conclusive as Israel had hoped. In other words, Iran retaliated with its ballistic missiles, and then the regime didn't fall in Iran, and the enemy was still standing, if you would, to fight for the fight to continue. So, but the June war, if you would, set in train a process of reckoning that basically showed itself when economic protest erupted in December, which it suggests, and the brutal way in which it was dealt with created a scenario in which yes, the regime survived this uprising, but there's now its legitimacy before its population is hugely diminished, if not gone, and that this demonstration probably presages other ones that will happen, and that Iran is now caught in a cycle, if you would, that with very little defense against attack from the outside, and then also at war with its own population at home. And as we're talking, President Trump may see advantage in this, or I think he's seen advantage in this, to talk of another major war with Iran. So, what happens with Iran is obviously going to be hugely important to what would be the ultimate outcome here, right? What pairs with the rise of Israel is the diminishment of Iran. But the end game is quite important. So what's at play? One is that the idea of basically that Iran will be finished off. Now, you could read this in multiple ways. I mean, this has scenarios of collapse in it, that there would be a collapse of state, there would be a Syriafication of Iran, something like what Libya happened, particularly in the case of a devastating war with the U.S., or that at least Iran would be weakened enough that it would not be a player as the sort of a final shape of the rest of the Middle East is decided, right? A country that has been so important in the past 47 years, for better, for worse, in varieties of arenas and across the region, would actually not be a factor as the future of Lebanon, Syria, on varieties of other issues in the region are decided. This perhaps would be what Israel would favor, that to knock out its adversary, not just knock it down, but knock it out. Knock it out as a threat, but knock it out as an obstacle that might stand in its way as it decides these other sets of things. The other scenario is that Iran might change, which seems like what President Trump has been hoping. In other words, under this kind of pressure, either the current leadership in Iran decides to change course, or that something gives, a change at the top, a crack, without a complete collapse. You basically have a reorientation. And the third is this actually where the region is in, I think is not about what happens internally in Iran, but it's actually keeping Iran in the game. I think, for instance, for Turkey, perhaps some Arab countries, Iran is not a threat anymore, but Iran is vital to a balance of power that they need to create. That a complete collapse of Iran, it makes it much more difficult for them to think of of a regional balance. But so I think between these two trends, between these two major outcomes of what the war has produced in terms of a military victor with tremendous amount of capabilities, and its adversary basically being taken out of the game in a major way, and the rest of the region trying to scramble for a semblance of a balance of power, the Middle East is not the same old Middle East. I mean, some of the issues are still there, but fundamental rules have changed. And finally, I would say that the key issue is that the end is not known. Right? Neither in Gaza, nor in Lebanon or Syria, and most importantly with Iran, it's not known. I mean, what happens with Iran next is probably the most consequential verdict on where the Middle East would go from here. And let me stop there. Thank you.
We will have 4 volunteers, floating microphones, and I'll try to bounce between folks if they have a question. Just raise your hand and one of the volunteers with the microphones will come to you. And again, just as a reminder, we'd like brief but sharp questions. So first of all, Vali, I just wanted to start off things by asking you, you sounded, by saying that until recently, Iran had essentially created another power in the region vis-a-vis its proxies. And now that power is significantly weakened. That seemed a little optimistic to me because, I mean, Hezbollah is still there, maybe weakened. Hamas still there. Can you tell me more about why you think that sort of proxy power that was opposed to Israel is less of an issue now?
Well, the proxy powers are an issue, but Israel's own actions suggest that they're not what they were. So when Israel attacked Iran, it had no worries about Hezbollah's missiles. It had no worries about any kind of attack coming out of Syria. Right now, when it plays its hand in Syria, the one country that doesn't matter to Israel's power play in Syria is actually Iran. Yes, the Houthis are there, and at some point, I'm sure the war will be taken to them. But the much freer hand that Israel feels to operate in the region, and particularly around it, suggests that it really doesn't take any of these proxies seriously. Not in the way that it did. In other words, they no longer perform a deterrence role. And I think there's a difference between politicians asking for absolute victory, like there shouldn't be even one Hezbollah person left, vis-a-vis whether the sort of the significant military, the military significance of Hezbollah is gone. And similarly, on the other side, that you had a situation where the Arab countries basically declared how important Iran was, by being worried about it, by constantly talking about Iran's role in the region. You don't hear it from them. You don't see that that's as urgent as it was. Doesn't mean that their attitudes towards the Islamic Republic has changed. It's just that they recognize that in Syria, it's not an obstacle to Saudi Arabia or Turkey. Or in Lebanon, it's much less capable of asserting its place.
Okay, so just staying with Iran for a moment. I know we're going to hear, obviously, a lot more about Iran in tomorrow. But do you think, you offered 3 scenarios for Iran's immediate future, right? And one of them being potential collapse. But then you also said that Iran is necessary in some capacity to create the new balance that you talked about, that the region may need to move towards. Do you think that sense of Iran's role in the future, that the Trump administration currently has a good understanding of that?
Well, I wouldn't say it's scenarios. I would put it as there are 3 things that are on the table, okay. Essentially, as far as the other actors looking at how does Iran fit into sort of a balance of power of the future. So one is that Iran will become absolutely irrelevant. right? In other words, before long, in a year or so, the Houthis or Iraq is also gone, Hezbollah settled. And then either because there is positive change or negative change in Iran, the country turns inwards, either into chaos, civil war, or a new regime. But it will not be a regional factor. In other words, basically, it's taken off the table, right? The second is that, no, it will be there, but it will change its behavior. And, it's kind of like when that's been periodically what President Trump has intimated what he wants, right? I don't want to, I just want him to be great again. I don't want him to necessarily go. Or when, let's say, Egypt invited Iran to the Sharm el-Sheikh meeting. Mm-hmm. I mean, the idea was that here's an opportunity, the whole region is together. Why don't you also come in and join in, basically, as part of that region, right? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily going to happen, but who knows? Under the tremendous amount of pressure of the Trump administration, something like this may give. I mean, when Trump administration says we want you to give up on your support of proxies, it in large measure means not just these particular proxies, but meddling in a negative way in any regional issue. That's basically it. Or that, but I think the rest of the region, for them, the importance of Iran is, and I would say also not necessarily always in that they have a particular view of the inside government in Iran, that Iran as an entity, as a power, its disappearance completely from the calculation in the Middle East then has a broad implications for how they manage the balance of power in the region.
Right. Looks like we have a question over here.
Thank you very much for an enlightening discussion. My question is, before October 7th, Saudi Arabia was concerned about Iran, and that was one of its considerations, or at least it was believed that one of its considerations for partnering with Israel. In light of Iran's perceived weakness now, do you think that Saudi Arabia is not as interested for that reason, since they don't fear Iran any longer?
Well, we have Bernie Hakel should answer that question tomorrow, knows a lot more than I would. But I would say that, obviously there are obstacles to the normalization that has to do with what Saudi Arabia has said about what he wants to see for the Palestinians. But what's fundamentally very different is when you have the Saudi Crown Prince intercede directly with President Trump about not bombing Iran, right, or not starting a war with Iran. Yes, there's a question of self-interest, that damage would not happen to the Gulf, etc. But this is a very different attitude towards Iran. So there was a time when Saudi Arabia was absolutely committed to the United States, what he called cutting off the head of the snake, right? So Iran is a lesser threat for a number of reasons. One is that Saudi Arabia itself took a diplomatic initiative to normalize its relations with Iran, and that for now has created ceasefire with the Houthis. So the urgent war in Yemen perhaps is not as much there, but also Saudi Arabia is also looking at the same scenarios that I mentioned. So I think the attitude of Saudi Arabia towards a strong Iran, which was lording over Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria all at once, versus dealing with an Iran that is diminished, is different. The only thing I would say is that whereas Israel's instinct is that, okay, Iran is down, finish it off. I don't think that perhaps it's not Saudi Arabia's instinct. That it's good Iran is diminished, it should remain diminished, but finishing it off is not necessarily in Saudi Arabia's interest. So I think that there is a divergence, as I said, between keeping him in the game versus finishing Iran off.
Could you talk a little bit more about why you don't think the Saudis see finishing off Iran in the Saudis' interest?
I would venture to say that, first of all, who would be the, you have to calculate, first of all, you have to calculate what's the cost of finishing Iran off. I mean, the cost to Israel is less because Israel doesn't border with Iran. Right? Whereas Saudi Arabia could be hit in retaliation, and if Iran becomes Syria, God knows, for the next 10 years what the Saudis have to deal with. How would they protect Vision 2030 from massive chaos in the region, right? So that's one thing. The cost of finishing off is different. Secondly, okay, if Iran is finished off, who else is standing? Right? So then there are three. There's Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel, and it makes it even more difficult to balance out against Israel if Iran is completely out of the picture. And if Iran turns into a sort of a quicksand of total chaos, it would be even more difficult for Saudi Arabia to manage the rest of the issues in the region. And so I think, it's completely self-interest, but it's also an estimation of how much threat is Iran, and is it the only threat that Saudi Arabia faces, and then are the other threats equal or larger? And all of this is sort of changed because Iran was there and is now here. So the chessboard would look different.
I think we have a question up here. Mic forward.
Hello, Dr. Nasr. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. My name is John Guzman. I'm a student representing the School of Policy and International Affairs at the University of Maine. Now, you touched on some key points like the axis of resistance, Israel rising to become an uncontested power in the Middle East, the GCC, the dynamics of power balance shifting in the Middle East, and the projection of Iran losing its power in terms of proxy. So I want to specifically touch upon some of your background experience too, especially in the SAIS. I know you're a senior advisor within that organization in the Middle East program. So it's looking at emerging order initiatives in the Middle East, such as diplomatic, economic, security, and stabilization trends in the region, and regional actors working with U.S. diplomats and public and private sector stakeholders.
Do you mind if I just ask what your question?
Yeah, so I'm gonna get to it, sorry. But
Sooner rather than later.
Looking at the 4 pillars of that initiative, my question to you is, what do you think that new regional stabilizer approach within that initiative is sustainable to the Middle East? And are those actors going to be able to mediate the conflict within those areas if given the opportunity? Or would the U.S. have to become the major actor within those players? And where does Israel kind of fit within that equation?
So, I mean, all of those pillars are important to future stability. And I think everybody wants to, and CSIS, the project wants to identify what those are and how to pursue them. But I think the issue is that we're still not in a post-war scenario in the Middle East. And you have to get there, whether even it's with the Palestinians in Gaza or Lebanon, Syria, or particularly with Iran, which actually the final battle hasn't even started, to basically see where the dust settles. As I mentioned, the United States actually no longer has a really clear sense of how it wants to do this. And in fact, we're seeing a lot more initiative in the region among the various actors to sort of rise up to the occasion. I mean, Saudi Arabia has taken leadership in many of these areas in Syria in conjunction with Turkey, etc. But so, Middle East is going to be licking its wounds from these 2.5 years of war, and it might be much longer, 2.5 years. We're only at year 2.5. And hopefully there will not be wars past this, and it will finish. These processes can't set in until this phase ends.
Yeah. I see you back there at number 1, but hold on for 1 second, because I just want to ask a quick follow-up, and then I'll come to mic 1 and then mic 2. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but what I found curiously missing from your talk was the Palestinian people. Because you started by stating the obvious, that it was the attacks on October 7th that basically turned over the table in terms of the status quo as the Middle East was. How can any new balance, whatever that balance may be, come to pass without some kind of resolution regarding Gaza and the West Bank? And is that even possible? Because as Israel is projecting its power more confidently, it's also further entwining itself in the West Bank. And I mean, Gaza, of course, has basically been razed to the ground, and we still have the next parts of the Trump negotiated peace plan yet to be settled.
No, it's a very good point. I mean, people in this region matter not only because they are the subject of the wars. I mean, wars happen on top of people. And that's true of Gaza, that's true of Lebanon, that's true of Syria, it's true of Iran. And people sometimes do have an agency. I mean, the Iranian people, the protests that they carried out has been a very, very big factor in even bringing us closer to this final scenario for the Islamic Republic. I mean, my focus was more on how the dynamic between the states is happening. But when I repeatedly say the Gaza war hasn't finished, that's what I mean. In other words, because in some ways you would say, yes, it is. I mean, Israel has basically devastated Hamas. Now, you can spend the next 10 years looking for the last single living Hamas and he's gone, but that's a sort of a very maximalist goal. But for all practical purposes, Hamas is no longer a threat to Israel's borders, right? And Israel has a free rein to continuously do what they call mowing the lawn. But the war in Gaza finishes when there is a settlement that is sustainable, right? And despite all the board of peace and all of the conversation, we're not close to that, right? So and similarly in Lebanon, the war in Lebanon is not over until there's an equitable settlement. Not only that Hezbollah disarms, but that you're not going to have another civil war down the road, or that you end up with a political system that is resilient, can survive going forward, and same for Syria. So I mean, all of these conflicts, Israel has basically come out on top in a very big way, but they're not over, right? And I think you could say that. And it happens in many wars. It's not about Israel. I mean, countries that come out of wars with this kind of a decisive victory, it is a moment at which they have to translate that decisive victory into a political settlement. And that's what we're not seeing in the Middle East. Right,
because in the absence of a workable and lasting political settlement, it seems to me, I keep saying the region in opposition to what I said in the introduction here, I'm sorry, but that it's just going to continue to lurch from war to war with periods of years and sometimes decades of status quo, right? Which isn't necessarily, it's not the building blocks for a long-term balance. Because again, at the risk of repeating myself, without some kind of resolution on the thing that not just triggered October 7th, but that has, one could say, is partially the cause of Iran's long-term support, right? Not only for Iranian power, but regarding Hamas, for example, that we're still kind of in the long-term, bigger picture status quo.
No, we are, and it may go further. Fundamentally, as I said, the issues in the Middle East are the same.
Yeah.
It's only certain rules have changed, which is the way Israel came out of this war so successful. It is basically operating on a theory that it can settle all conflicts indefinitely with military means. It has shown no inclination to, as I said, to sort of translate that military victory into a lasting political settlement in any of these countries. And the United States, for the first time, is also completely absent in that regard. So yes, we have a board of peace, but the board of peace is actually not doing anything to force peace, right? And so you're correct. I mean, the issues ultimately, there is no theory on the table by the victor, right? If you thought that says, okay, I'm going to translate this total victory against axis of resistance, these bad forces that we've said were harming the region, to create a situation where their comeback would be impossible, right? So that we're not in that moment. I mean, and until we get in that moment, you're right. We may end up with periods of peace punctuated back by war.
I promise to go over here to mic number 1.
Thank you for your presentation. Kevin Lipson from Port Clyde, Maine, and Tel Aviv, Israel. I have a question for you about the premise of your rebalancing. The premise is, you called it Israel's acting as a hegemon. And I'm wondering whether you use that term, hegemony, to suggest an expansion of its presence in other countries, or an insurance of its self-defense and its secure borders.
No, it always could be defense and secure borders. That's the way a country might see it. But ultimately, the issue is not whether the motivation for how Israel embarked on this war. It's a question of the balance that its power currently in the region has. So the Israel has emerged. The word hegemony means that it's emerged as a singular military power in the region that is capable of projecting power far and wide, and in a way that it can be the most dominant military and ultimately a force in the region that can decide the settlement of varieties of conflicts, borders, etc. That's the definition of hegemony. And this is not unique to Israel. There are many countries who've come out of wars which has basically given them that kind of a dominant position. And then everybody else begins to balance in a way in reaction to that much larger power. I mean, it remains for Israel to see how it would exercise that power. But the fact of the matter is that the Middle East was a sort of a rivalry between Iran and Israel. The Arabs saw Iran as a large, big power. And as I said, there was a period in time when the Arabs were dominant, Israel, Iran, and Turkey allied together. Now, Israel has come out of these wars essentially as a singular power. And it's not a question of good, bad, or is it because of self-defense or offense, or is it imperial ambition, etc. It is what it is, which is there is one power that right now is the most militarily capable and dominant and self-confident in terms of getting the security, as you say, that it wants without having to compromise over it, whether it's with the Palestinians or with the Lebanese or with the Syrians or with the Turks. And so that's the definition of a hegemonic capability. And it's not, as I said, the initial motivation, Israel sees it in its own mind that it's engaged in self-defense, and that's true to it. But in the eyes of the other, it's not the motivation that they're looking at. They're looking at the reality of an Israel that is much more powerful and willing to exercise that power, and it's not balanced by any regional force or by any restraint from the U.S. So it makes for a very different Middle East. It's a Middle East in which Israel is the dominant force.
I just want to acknowledge I see you. I'm going to come next to 2 after my quick follow-up, and then 3, and then we have a question from a remote viewer, and then did I see 4? Okay, so this is the order we're going to go in. But I do want to ask a quick follow-up. The map that you had up earlier, I think, was actually incredibly instructive because it was a very sharp visualization of the fact that Israel is a nation that is almost entirely surrounded by antagonistic countries, right? There was a time, I think it was last year, that I spoke with an Israeli analyst who said that the nation is essentially fighting a 7-front war, is what he called it. And so in thinking in terms of this question of balance in the region, if you are Israel, and even I'd say the United States, for as long as the Saudis are on board with this newly empowered Israel, is that not, again, let's say from a Washington's perspective, a satisfactory balance?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. I think you should have to ask Bernie that. To what extent are they on board?
I'll save that one for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, because he really knows a lot better about this. But I think the question is not black or white. It's not like sometimes Israel is, let's say, Saudi Arabia or UAE or Qatar or Turkey are 100% on board or 100% not on board. It's a question of how do they assess their national interest in a new dispensation. Like they assessed their national interest when Iran was up and there was that balance and shadow war between Iran and Israel. And they clearly then, they saw that Iran was a greater threat and they should work with Israel. Now, if you change the boundary lines and rules of the game, you have to anticipate that then Saudi national interests will calculate differently. Right. So yes, they're on board with certain things, but maybe they're not on board with basically being dominated by Israel or being told what to do by Israel. Or if Israel was to tell them, no, you cannot do this in Syria, you have to do that in Syria. Because my assumption is that there's a difference between saying you normalize with Israel when you could extract certain things from Israel, or you normalize with Israel where you can't extract anything from Israel.
Right.
And so the terms of these conversations have shifted.
Right. It's fascinating to me because in the case of both Israel and Saudi Arabia, the United States still has incredible leverage there regarding military assistance, first of all, and that is a tool that could be used. But I'm going to hold, I dropped that in this conversation. I'm going to hold there, and because I don't want to ignore our audience questions. So go ahead here, number 2.
Yashka Winterling from Bangor, Maine. Thank you for coming and speaking to us this evening. My question is regarding Iran. We've seen over the past couple years a lot of unrest from the people of Iran and uprisings break out. And I want to know if you anticipate a more long-term upraising by the Iranians that could actually topple the regime and bring about new leadership, and how Iran's proxies might react to that, both during a conflict, whether they would get involved or sort of just stand back and watch how things play out, and also in a post-conflict Iran with new leadership. Would they maintain their alliance or would they start to break away? Thank you.
I mean, the second part of your question is actually pretty interesting because I think one of the things that's very clear in the region is a great deal of nervousness, not just among the proxies, but among the Shia populations in the region. Mm-hmm. That if Iran disappears or ceases to support them, that even within their own countries, their balance of power, their positions will shift. I mean, if the Iranian people rise up, there's not much that the proxies can do about it. If Iran changes from the Islamic Republic that's been for the past 47 years, for them it's a monumental change. Then they have to calculate how they react to it. Can they survive on their own? Can they not? Do they need to change as well? And I think country by country it will be different. Already in Iraq, you're seeing some elements of that, of some proxies joining the political process, etc. Inside Iran, my own feeling is that, it's difficult to time when a people would rise up and when a regime would collapse, but it's very clear that all the indications are not for stability for the Islamic Republic going forward. Its economic situation is extremely dire. This is in good measure owes to U.S. maximum pressure sanctions, but those sanctions are tied to Iran's regional behavior and foreign policy. And so that's not going to change unless Iran becomes a completely different kind of a country, whether under Islamic Republic or not. The population is now, opposed to the regime, passively, actively, in uprising, seething quietly. So for decades, the Islamic Republic claimed that it had its people or a big chunk of its people with it. It doesn't. So it has to now fight on two fronts, outside the US and Israel, and also against its own population. And at some point, this is not tenable. Now, whether it just collapses or there's an uprising or that some leaders in the country decide that they need to change, I just think that we're in the last chapter. Now, how many pages are this chapter? I don't know, but it's the end game. Let's put it that way.
Up there to mic 3, please.
I'm Mark Puglisi from MDI, and I have a couple things. The first thing is, if Israel is the hegemon, do you think that, and given Israel's avowed what it says its interests are, do you think that means that within a couple years it will officially announce the annexation of the West Bank? Because it is the hegemon, and according to you, there's no balance of power to push back against that, which leads me to my second question. There's an internal check that might be for Israel, which is we're all in it, the United States. So as a thought experiment, if we woke up tomorrow and the United States decided to change its undying support for Israel and became critical of it and even stopped supporting Israel, how would that affect Israel's hegemonic power? So first, West Bank, going to be part of Israel soon, yes or no? Or B, what happens if the United States, as a thought experiment, Professor, decides not to support Israel? How does that affect its power?
Well, I mean, whether Israel makes that decision to annex the West Bank or not, perhaps is an internal Israeli dynamic. There's many things that might go into it. But one thing is clear at this moment, there's none of the powers in the region can do anything about it in a really effective way. They cannot, in other words, the region cannot prevent Israel from making that decision. So whether it's the United States, Europe, Israeli public, etc., that's a whole different issue. And so, and to your second question, I mean, obviously, if you looked at what are the elements of Israel's power, United States, both in terms of its support, military and otherwise, is a big part of what constitutes Israel's power. I mean, the U.S. doesn't fight Israel's wars for it, but Israel's diplomatic support, friendship, close alliance with Israel is greatly important to it. So, yeah, I mean, yes, many things can happen. But again, going back to sort of the premise, none of these two things, that issue is not on the table. You know, the region is operating on the assumption that, that for the first time, the U.S.'s role in the region is not to support its allies against an adversary, that it has to choose between allies, let's say, like what happened with Qatar, between Israel attacking Qatar and both are allies. And this is how the United States will behave going forward in that kind of a scenario is completely new to the region. For the past 47 years, U.S.'s deep involvement in the region was to protect the region against Iran. All of the bases that were built in the region was against Iran. All of the alliances the U.S. built was, particularly around the Gulf, was about containment of Iran. So if the game is not about Iran, and the game is no longer about Hezbollah, and the game is not about terrorists, then it's quite fuzzy about where the U.S. is, what decisions U.S. would make, let's say, if Saudi Arabia and UAE are fighting, right? Both very close allies, right? So then it becomes much more complicated for the region to figure out what it is, where the United States would fit in. And the U.S. basically, I think this is also completely new for the U.S. That's why it's so much easier for the U.S. to keep talking about Iran. Because it really doesn't have a theory about what a U.S. role in the region in which you have to referee between friends of the United States might look like.
Let's go to, I'll do the screen question, and then we'll go up to 4, and then back down here. So we have this question coming in from Shanghai, actually, as you can see it. It's, how important is the Farsi-Arabic divide in terms of trust and easy relations between leaders?
Well, those have been there for the past 47 years. I mean, Iran also has a Shia identity, had it after the revolution, is Iranian speaking. It's not seen as as member of the family of the Arab countries. The Arab countries often say Iran has no business in Arab affairs, means that Arab countries can have, legitimate role in Arab issues, but Iran doesn't. So that goes basically to the fact that Iran, like Turkey, like Israel, is ethnically different from the Arabs. So it's not welcome if it meddles in Arab affairs. It's not part of the family. So yes, it's important. And it's going to continue to be important. It was also important when the Shah was ruling over Iran. It obviously became a much bigger issue when Iran was literally trying to be stationed in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria. But that's a problem the Iranians will always have. They're part of the region, but they're not the member of the largest family in the region.
Up there for mic 4, please.
Hi, I'm Logan Johnson from Gould Academy, and you mentioned some of the wars fought to keep balance and peace in Iran and that area. Do you see American involvement or other countries' involvement military-wise as a positive or just fuel to the fire?
Well, I mean, our military advantage in recent years in the Middle East has not produced, stable, positive outcomes in a way, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Iraq, etc. So unless next time it's done much better, I wouldn't say necessarily something to hang our hat on. Secondly, this time around, at least with Iran, it's not clear to me what the U.S. objective is, what the level of its commitment is. I think many Iranian people would like a United States who would say we're committed to basically militarily changing your regime, bringing something much, much better. But President Trump is not committed to that. So, I think what it might do is, rather than the United States trying to end this phase of wars in the Middle East in order to get to what comes next, it would just prolong wars. Let's say if an Iran-America war takes another 2 years, or you end up with other wars coming out of it, and this extends to 3-4 years, and you have another conference 3-4 years from now, and we're still talking about wars in the Middle East, then that's not good for the region.
To say the least.
To say the least. But also in particular, you see location matters, because you see, if you were to say the good news in the Middle East has been in the Gulf in the past decade. Right? Those are the ones, aside from the money, that have the vision, the drive to build these new economies in the region, right? They are sitting right where this next war would be. Yes. So the idea of exactly how you would start a war that you're not sure you're going to end against a country of 92 million people, and yet be able to somehow protect the Gulf economies so that they can pursue their visions, it's extremely difficult to fathom.
Yeah. Something like, what, 1/5 of the world's oil goes through the Straits of Hormuz?
Well, oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz, but also these economies have invested massively in AI, in data centers, in future technologies, in being hub of the global finance and global trade. So, when my reading of it was when President Trump went to these 3 countries, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, when he became president, essentially he had to confront which is more important to him, a war with Iran or actually investing in these 3 countries, changing the Middle East completely, right? In which case he had to have a different kind of a policy with Iran, like go have a nuclear deal or find a way to just lower the temperature. Right, just like what Saudi Arabia itself had done, UAE itself had done by opening their embassies, trying to manage Iran. So he seemed to be convinced of that, and then he veered off, right? I mean, right now, he's basically, I would assume that the message from the Gulf is that you're playing with our futures, right? Without even having a guarantee of what you're going to get out of Iran, you're putting our futures in jeopardy, and I would say the president, the United States has to decide which is more important to it, what the Gulf countries are doing or trying to change the regime in Iran by force.
It's an interesting place to be because, as you said, on the one hand, the United States is actually quite limited in its ability to stop, say, for example, Israel, in projecting Israel continue to project its military power. But on the other hand, the uncertainty currently being demonstrated by the President of the United States is one of the main causes for continued and now, dire uncertainty in the region. So, well, I'll just just leave that as a thought once again, because I'm not sure there's an answer to it, as you said, until the president sort of clarifies what he wants from U.S. military presence around Iran right now. And also, we're out of time, so we'll just take this one last question here.
Matt Lack from Camden. How do you assess the effect of President Trump putting the whole of the negotiating effort in the Middle East and in Ukraine, Russia, in the hands of Steve Witkoff, a wealthy crony real estate broker who makes side deals for his family in the and apparently sidelining the experts and diplomats for the State Department?
I think you know the answer to your own question, but
We'd still like to hear you articulate it, though.
but no, I think the problem is, well, I mean, first of all, it is important. No, it isn't. There would have been a way to have your cake and eat it too, which is if the president trusts his close associates to be his conduits, they could have been staffed with very senior ambassadors who essentially would have managed the process of the negotiation. Then it makes sense to go into a 3-hour meeting with the Iranians and then immediately go into a meeting with the Russians and Ukrainians. And then you would say, you know, these senior ambassadors and their staff, et cetera, would manage the process. But that's lacking. So essentially what you would think that the U.S. is asking for is a declarative general understanding as opposed to something that the both sides are ready to put their signature on. And so what the president is looking for is to come out of a meeting in Geneva with the Iranians and say, we're in agreement that Iran's nuclear program is no longer a problem, that they're not going to enrich, and I've solved another 3,000-year conflict in the Middle East. But the reality is the Iranians are looking for, okay, what day do we shutter our program, at what time, under what conditions, who's going to see it? Every little thing has to be detailed, gone over, every comma, et cetera. That's why the JCPOA took 2 years to negotiate, and it was 156 pages long. Whether it was a good deal, bad deal, it was a deal that was negotiated, every term of it was negotiated. I mean, countries would be very, particularly a country like Iran, which is, its back is to the wall, it's alone, this is everything for it, to basically sign on to something like this without having anything tangible from the United States, right? And so it's not going to work. And also experience does matter. I mean, we train people to go to universities to invest in careers in order to basically have that expertise to do that. I mean, these issues that the president is trying to solve are issues of life and death to other countries, right? They have invested massively for better or for worse in it. It's their futures that's on the line. It's their territories that's on the line. And you just can't go, into a 3-hour meeting and expect you're going to come out and say it's done.
That must be explained to the current president of the United States is something else. But Vali Nasr, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Incredible start. It's an absolutely worthy start for the remainder of the conference. Tomorrow is going to just build upon what you heard from Vali tonight. We'll be talking about deeper history of the region, and you'll also get insight into several specific countries. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, of course, Iran will come up. We'll talk about Israel as well. Doors open at 8 o'clock. Yes, no, well, it starts at 9, but your doors will open before that. Don't forget your badge. Won't let you in without it. And I look forward to seeing all of you here and remotely tomorrow for day 2. Thank you very much.